My friends, why is everyone now hiring Colombian mercenaries? Colombia, the war machine that produces mercenaries. That's how hundreds of Colombians ended up being directly involved in civil wars in Africa. What makes Colombian mercenaries so interesting? This is exactly what we will try to answer in this video.
This man is a mercenary.
Colombian mercenaries first came into the spotlight in 2021 after an incident when 21 Colombians were accused of taking part in the assassination of Haiti's president Jovenel Moïse. Even worse, it was revealed that many of these Colombians were former military personnel. Since then, Colombian mercenaries were spotted a little bit all over the world. Some were attracted by the lucrative contracts in rich Middle Eastern countries, while others, hundreds, possibly thousands of Colombians, ended up fighting in Ukraine. That's where they got teleported into gritty modern warfare, reminiscent of World War I, fighting in the middle of muddy trenches under artillery fire. Often they're being sent to the hottest parts of the front as shock units, like these Colombians running across the ruins of Bakhmut sometime in spring 2022. Just like with the incident in Haiti, we will also cover the Colombian mercenaries that decided to embrace the dark side of the force. That's right, hundreds of Colombian veterans are now in Mexico, teaching cartels how to use modern weaponry and all the latest military tactics. The irony, right? Former Colombian soldiers that fought narcos in their homeland, now hired by Mexican narcos.
A great success!
And if this tragedy could not get worse, since Colombian mercenaries can be seen everywhere, they often end up on opposing sides.
Fuck.
That man's an imposter! That man is the imposter!
I guess that's the true definition of guns for hire. Welcome to History Legends. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my latest videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. For decades, Colombia has been facing a vicious war against Marxist guerrillas and narco-insurgents. In the year 2000, the US directly stepped in to provide support for the Colombian armed forces with Plan Colombia. That's how thousands of Colombian soldiers now went through US military training.
Hand grenade range, 35 meters. Structures, we have the asidero where all the acids, those are usually kept different of these labs, or they're in inaccessible areas.
Yet quickly the United States saw an opportunity. In 2005, there were already articles mentioning over 1,000 Colombian combat-trained ex-soldiers and policemen operating in Iraq. Mercenaries trained by the US Navy and the DEA, and hired by private military contractor firms like Blackwater and Triple Canopy. By 2010, there were hundreds of Colombian nationals fighting in Afghanistan. Most of them worked as security guards at various facilities around the country. So as you can see, the story of Colombian mercenaries dates back at least 2 decades. In this French reportage from 2012, a journalist followed a squad of Colombian soldiers at the tip of their spear in their operations against insurgents. However, all of a sudden, they got ambushed, and one by one, the Colombian soldiers fell on the battlefield. The situation was so desperate that the soldier even asked the journalist if he could pick up a gun and shoot. But moments later, that soldier was KIA. The journalist was the last man standing, and he was captured by the insurgents. This goes to show the intensity of the fighting in Colombia. As a matter of fact, between 2004 and 2024, approximately 5,000 Colombian soldiers and police officers were KIA in the ongoing conflict. These days, the Colombian army still faces a wide array of threats that challenge national security. Among the most persistent are insurgent groups like the National Liberation Army or ELN, as well as dissident factions of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, better known as the FARC, groups that refuse to demobilize following the 2016 peace accord. You guessed it, these guerrilla groups mostly operate in the jungle covering the country, but regions that also happen to be the major coca growing areas.
It's coincidence.
For example, in this video, you can see the extent of combat operations against FARC guerrillas in the village of El Plateado. Additionally, the Colombian armed forces also face a never-ending list of cartels, the largest one being El Golfo Cartel. So it's not a surprise that Colombia has Latin America's second largest army after Brazil. with the nearly 200,000 active duty personnel as part of the ground component alone. That also means Colombia has tens of thousands of veterans with significant combat experience. Did you know that Colombia had mandatory military service? According to Merco Press, between 2017 and 2022, 460,000 young men were drafted into the armed forces, or an average of 90,000 per year. Now, instead of a mandatory military service for everyone, Colombia resorts to a lottery system for all eligible males once they turn 18. Realistically, there are many ways of having your name taken off the draft, like being a student, healthcare issues, being the sole provider for your family, being married with kids, and so on. The duration of military service is 12 months if you have a high school diploma, and if you don't, you have to stay for at least 18 months. All this to say that hundreds of thousands of Colombians are well versed in the art of handling weapons. Now, the problem of having such a large army is that pay is low. The minimum wage in Colombia is about 300 USD a month. In comparison, conscripts are only paid $140, whereas regular soldiers can expect at least 460 USD. Additionally, due to the constant influx of recruits, the Colombian Ministry of Defense doesn't seem to take proper care of its veterans or injured military personnel. One soldier called Rafael told Deutsche Welle, "I myself resigned from the army because after being wounded in combat with the FARC, the institution abandoned me. Thousands of Colombian soldiers retire each year, and they can expect a lifelong pension of 400 to 600 USD per month. However, from what I've read, it's not enough to make a living and feed your entire family." Reality is that the job market in Colombia is pretty limited. But that's also when many former soldiers realize that the skills they learned in the military are of little use in civilian life. Those that stay can expect to work as bodyguards, but even then, positions are limited. So many decide to look abroad for job opportunities. Traditionally, the ones that are the most fit and motivated could try to go through the rigorous selection process of the French Foreign Legion. In this article by French military news website OPEX 360, we learned that now recruits to the Foreign Legion come mainly from Nepal, Brazil, and Colombia. There are no official figures by the French Foreign Legion of number of recruits by country of origin, but I took a look at the work at François-Michel Le Tourneau, and we can estimate at least 750 Colombians serving at all times in the French Foreign Legion. 750 out of 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers, essentially 10% of all legionnaires. Starting salary is nothing glorious, just over 1,600 euros a month. This is done on purpose by the French Foreign Legion because they don't want to have recruits that are only there for financial reasons. At the same time, Colombian soldiers say that the French Foreign Legion is pretty chill these days, since there's not much fighting going on. With that being said, Colombians are especially liked in the Legion because of their professionalism and their experience in jungle warfare. Naturally, one of the problems in the French Foreign Legion could be the language barrier. That's why hundreds of Colombians also tried their luck in the Spanish Legion, La Legión Española. According to Spain's Ministry of Defense, there is a battalion of 2,633 Colombians. That's huge, and that's an increase from 1,872 Colombians in 2007. As many former Colombian soldiers look towards Europe, others prefer the lucrative contracts they can get in the Middle East, the majority of whom end up in the United Arab Emirates. If you're interested, I made an entire video about the UAE and their Carthage-like army of mercenaries, link in the description below. In 2015, the New York Times revealed that a brigade of nearly 1,800 Latin American soldiers trained at an Emirati military base, of which a majority of Colombians. At the time, the base salary was about $90 a day, so just under 3,000 USD. Now, due to the competitive salary, the selection process is extremely rigorous and positions are limited. For example, places are usually open only to men younger than 40 years old, thus disqualifying many retired Colombian professional soldiers. Spanish newspaper El País interviewed Dante Hincapié, a retired officer from Colombia's Armed Forces General Command. He said that his retirement pension was insufficient, so he went to the UAE as communications commander of an Emirati army battalion made up solely of Colombians. According to him, there were 3 battalions of Latin Americans. The first at 10% Colombians, the second 90%, and the third was entirely Colombian, the one he was attached to. Overall, Incapi said that during his time there were about 2,000 Colombians in the Emirati army. We also learned that the company GSSG sent about 30 Colombians a week to the UAE. That means a rotation of 1,500 Colombians every year. That's how Incapi is one of perhaps 10,000 Colombians who have served as Middle East mercenaries over the past decade, most hired by the UAE and nearly all former soldiers. Now it's also important to mention that contrary to the French Foreign Legion and the Spanish Legion, that mostly recruit riflemen and the rank and file, the UAE also hires former officers and weapons specialists. Although these Latin American mercenaries were initially thought for population control against possible riots from the huge mass of foreign labor, soon enough, hundreds of Colombians were fighting the Houthis in Yemen. According to rumors, out of a contingent of 3,000 Colombians, 800 were to be deployed in Yemen. Naturally, many of these operators complained that this mission was beyond the scope of their contract. So the UAE offered a $1,000 weekly bonus for any volunteer.
I love gold!
In the end, about 300 of them agreed to fight. We don't know exactly the number of casualties, but we do have some little bits of information. For example, we know that during an ambush on December 9th, 2017, 15 contractors were KIA, 10 of which were Colombian. Most recently, Colombian mercenaries once again came into the spotlight for their activities in this region. Colombian mercenaries recruited to fight alongside paramilitaries in Sudan's civil war. In the past weeks, 22 Colombian mercenaries are said to have fallen fighting for the Rapid Support Forces, a Sudanese faction backed by the UAE. If you're intrigued about this exotic conflict in Sudan, I did an entire video about it. If you're curious, the link is in the description. As for this contingent that went to Sudan, we learned that it's a PMC called A4SI, founded by former Colombian officers, that hired at least 300 Colombian mercenaries. As for the big ambush, here we can read, about 160 Colombian fighters were part of a caravan traveling from Libya into Sudan in mid-November 2024, when they were attacked by government-affiliated militias, after which many ID cards belonging to Colombian nationals were found on the site of the ambush. Oh yeah, 1 month earlier, one group of Colombian mercenaries was attacked in October near the town of El Fasher. Among the dead was a Colombian named Diego Edison Hernandez, a drone pilot. And that's essentially all the information we have available about the activities of former Colombian soldiers in the Middle East. Now everything changed in February 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Ukraine's call for foreign volunteers. Here you can see GoPro footage of a unit of Colombian fighters running across the rubble somewhere in Bakhmut in spring 2022. Meanwhile, some of their comrades were holding some muddy trenches outside the city. But it's really in 2023 that we started hearing more and more about these Colombians fighting on the front in Ukraine. One former combat medic of the Colombian military called Héctor Bernal admitted that during the second half of 2023, he trained more than 20 men that later went on to fight in Ukraine. Since the trip from Colombia to Europe is pretty expensive to get there, many of these men borrowed money or sold some of their possessions like cars. Once at the Ukrainian border, they explained that they want to volunteer into the armed forces of Ukraine and they're in. Overall, foreign volunteers either join the International Legion or get attached to various units in the AFU, like the 49th Karpatska Sich Assault Battalion.
Pertenecemos al batallón número 49 Karpatska Sich de Ucrania. Aquí estamos con 100% con valor y gloria, con mística, con energía al 100.
There's so many Colombians now in Ukraine that some Ukrainian brigades have entire detachments composed entirely of Colombians. For example, on the 12th of January 2025, it was reported that the 95th Air Assault Brigade had an entire company made up of Colombians. Unlike the first wave of foreign volunteers that arrived in Ukraine primarily for ideological reasons, Colombians mostly flocked into the armed forces of Ukraine because of a promise of a good salary. In this case, we can really talk about mercenaries.
Give me the money, okay?
In this article by Euronews, we learn that they're not volunteers who want to defend the flag of another country. They're simply motivated by an economic need. Manuel Barrios joined the battle against Russian forces in Ukraine because a bank threatened to repossess his home in Colombia. Luis Alejandro Herrera returned to the front to recover the savings he lost in a failed attempt to enter the United States. These former Colombian soldiers go to Ukraine because they can expect a salary going from 3,000 to 4,000 USD per month, sometimes even more. Sometimes much less if they got screwed over when they signed the contract, but more on that later. After setting up a local bank account in Ukraine, they send a debit card back home so that their family members can withdraw money directly from an ATM. On the surface, everything looks perfect. Ukraine needs more troops. Hardened professionals from Colombia are helping. It's true that by Colombian standards, $3,000 to $4,000 a month seems extraordinary. The opportunity of a lifetime. But once at the front, these professionals found a war very different from the one they have experienced in the jungle against insurgents. They went from being the hunters to the hunted. I mean, just look at the face of this Colombian volunteer talking about the casualties in his unit. To me, it says everything. Very quickly, they all complained about the lethality of enemy weapons, mainly artillery, but also tanks, armored vehicles, drones. In this video, we can see a Colombian fighter casually recording a video with artillery shelling in the background. This Colombian was just eating his meal when a shell landed a couple meters away. All this naturally leads to high casualties. Often utilized as shock units, Colombian troops find themselves holding some of the most difficult positions on the contact line. Here you can see a rifle squad doing a quick prayer before going to the front. And then comes the reality of holding a front line. Those are their living conditions, muddy trenches, where they have to face rain and the cold, where they have to spend week after week, month after month in rudimentary living quarters. And then comes winter and the cold, which these guys experience for the first time in their lives. Soon enough, Colombian fighters started warning their compatriots about the reality of war in Ukraine.
Recuerde que esos que están pensando en llegar aquí a Ucrania, sépalo ni entiéndalo que vienen es a una guerra, no vienen de paseo. Están pagando 19 millones de pesos al mes, un muy buen sueldo. Pero recuerde que también vienen a perder la vida.
Y los dejaron solos en una guerra contra un gigante. Usted no se imagina lo que usted ve acá. Acá se pudo trabajar en un tiempo, se podía sostener una trinchera y ganarse 3, 4 sueldos. Ahorita no se puede. La artillería que tiene Rusia en este momento es demasiado potente. Y acá, en los últimos días, hemos perdido a más de 10 compatriotas. Más de 10 compatriotas.
You heard it in this video how this guy lost 10 men in his unit in the last few days. In an interview, one of these mercenaries said that out of the 60 Colombians who had joined with him, only about 7 remained. The rest were either KIA, wounded, or returned home after a few weeks at the front. This man is laughing, telling war stories, joking around, when we clearly notice that he's partially bionic. Maybe that privilege will grant him a night with Ukraine's most patriotic actress. Let's go back to Manuel Barrios that I introduced to you earlier. As a former soldier, he went to Ukraine to get some money because the bank threatened to repossess his house weeks after his wife gave birth to their 3rd child. Soon enough, he saw what the war in Ukraine was really about and how dangerous it was. His wife kept telling him, "Come back, don't leave me alone with the kids." And he kept repeating, "Sweetheart, I have to save the house." After only 20 days at the front, Manuel Barrios fell after a Russian missile strike. He died before even receiving his first paycheck. Now the wife still has her 3 children and the bank running after her, but no more husband. It's literally a nightmare scenario. She didn't even receive compensation for his death. She explained that she has to get a lawyer in Ukraine to sort everything out, but she simply doesn't have the money for this at the moment. Oh yeah, actually she did receive something, a box full of Ukrainian flags with his personal belongings. Out of these 3 men I showed you earlier in this video, this one was confirmed as KIA. These foreign mercenaries from the Karpatska Sich battalion did a minute of silence after naming their fallen comrades. They named precisely 18 men by their call signs.
Gaula, Cucuta, Caraballo, Damián, Negro, lince, chacal, piraña, yoque, guajiro, macho, 88, halcón, muerte, bad boy, leopardo, cuervo, bombardero. Siempre con nosotros, ¡ajúa! ¡Ajúa!
As always, the same eternal problem with mercenaries. Cam issues related to the lack of payment and the mistreatment of these combatants by the AFU. There was a lot of discontent among the ranks of Colombian fighters in the summer of 2023, and at the end of July, a huge fight erupted.
Del cuerpo 25 colombianos muertos, ¿para qué este hijo de metió un gas?
This guy says that's why people leave, so much humiliation. As you can see in this video, another fight erupted in the barracks. There are many videos of the incident and the situation seems confusing. Actually, here we can see the alleged commander of the Colombian Legion, Ivan Vovk. You can spot him in this picture taken around the same time. Back to the video, this guy said, "Masked men have just came in to beat up our guys." Now that's the irony, they think it's because they're foreigners, Latinos, that they're seen as inferior. No, let me tell you. Welcome to the Ukrainian family. The AFU does exactly the same thing to their own men. Now this video is interesting because it's like the Rosetta Stone. Spanish audio with French and English subtitles. He said, "We're located in the Liman sector with the 60th Mechanized Brigade. We're leaving, we're finalizing the contract. And they're not letting us go. Everything they told us in Ternopil, which is the main training center for foreigners, it was all a lie, it was deception. Yeah, well, missing payments, getting beaten up, deserting. I don't know, to me they've been fully integrated into the AFU. But that being said, there hasn't been videos like that since this incident. So let's hope that overall the situation improved for foreign volunteers. Check out this video from June 2024. We see a Colombian mercenary that was captured by the Russians. That's a clean video. There's another one of him that I can't show you where his face is pretty bruised up. We have to admit that he's lucky to still be alive, knowing what the Russians usually do with foreign volunteers. Now in the interview, he explains that he was misguided, that he would only be a security guard in Ukraine and so on. The same story as always.
Right.
Now the moment you were all waiting for. What about the number of casualties in the ranks of Colombian foreign volunteers in Ukraine? Well, until December 2024, we could see the total number of KIA of the International Legion on Wikipedia. But not anymore. As of now, the only thing we know is that Colombia is the second most represented country in terms of casualties. Before they removed the number of fatalities on Wikipedia, the last update on the 11th of December 2024 showed 51 fallen Colombians. But like I told you, it's not the full picture, since many foreign volunteers are attached to various units across the AFU. According to Russian Telegram channels that track foreign mercenaries, by the 28th of December 2024, 146 Colombians were confirmed as KIA in Ukraine. So you see it's already tripled the number officially announced by the International Legion. Meanwhile, the Colombian Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that 310 of their compatriots had been KIA according to their own investigation by the 19th of November 2024. As you can see, you can get an idea of the magnitude of casualties in the Colombian contingent. At this rate, as of today, we could be around 350 Colombians KIA, maybe more. Now there's also what the mainstream media is not talking about. The Colombians that decided to enlist in the Russian armed forces.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
In this interview, Russian war reporter War Gonzo asked this Colombian mercenary the question that all men ask one another: if the women are prettier in Russia or in Colombia. Politely, he says Russia, but what do you think? Is he right? Is he wrong? Actually, the first time we heard about Colombians fighting on the Russian side was with Alexis Castillo. He had been fighting with the DPR separatist Piatnashka International Brigade since 2014. He quickly rose to fame in Russia and he's portrayed in many videos and documentaries on Russian TV. That was until he fell in Donbass sometime in October 2022. Here you can see a picture of his son Miguel during the burial. In his honor, these Latin American volunteers renamed their entire unit after him. in this video of Wagner Mercenaries. The one recording the video asked each one of them where they come from. They named various Russian cities, until he turns to these two men from Colombia.
Which city you from? Medellin, Colombia. Buga Valle.
That's right, this means at times, Colombian fighters on opposing sides end up shooting each other. I guess that's the true definition of mercenaries. Truth be told, there have been many such cases in history. The first example that comes to mind is when one of the Irish battalions of the Union attacked the one fighting for the South during the Battle of Fredericksburg. While all this was going on, there were reports that some Colombian veterans of the Ukraine war ended up in Mexico, where they joined entire units filled with their compatriots. This article by Mexican agency Proceso is titled Carteles Mexicanos reciclan a militares y exguerrilleros colombianos, or translated into Mexican cartels recycle Colombian military and ex-guerrillas. I mean, these guys have fully embraced the dark side of the force. They went from fighting narcos in their homeland only to be hired by the same narcos but in Mexico.
A few moments later.
Once again, the motives are purely economic. Mexican cartels pay for the trip and offer them $2,500 to $4,000 per month. From what I read, it's especially interesting for former Colombian soldiers that are over the age of 40 and that cannot be recruited in the UAE. Of course, there are many stories out there of these guys claiming they have been deceived. As they were promised, you guessed it, simple security jobs. These Colombians are hired by various cartels as combat instructors for their gunmen, snipers, medics, machine gunners, and also as K9 unit specialists. You see, the dogs they're trained are assigned for the direct security of these cartel bosses. And they can also detect explosives. Talking about explosives, Colombians are also directly linked to the massive increase of IEDs and landmines in Mexico, which are increasing the number of casualties in the ranks of Mexican military personnel. And these Colombians are also hired as drone operators. This explains the growing number of drone strikes, since they now even have specialized units of drone operators that they call droneros. Former Colombian military personnel are also much liked because they know the tactics of irregular warfare, they know how to conduct intelligence and reconnaissance, and they know how to control territories and take the points that interest the lords there. Essentially, they're used as shock units to capture key positions before being rotated out. In the article, it was mentioned that a group of 12 former Colombian commandos got paid $25,000 for a special mission. That's over 4 years of salary up front. There's so many Colombians working for the Mexican cartels that there have been cases of clashes between groups in which there are Colombians on both sides and they end up shooting at each other. As you can imagine, these deployments also come with their fair share of risk. Here we learned that Mexico's National Guard shot at Colombian mercenaries on a migrant smuggling route near the US, leaving 2 of them KIA and another 4 of them wounded. Former soldier Jose Macana, who was part of Colombia's Army Special Forces Regiment, turned 50 in Mexico. 5 months have passed without any news from him. Same story here about 34-year-old Samuel Pava, a former Colombian soldier who disappeared in Mexico in February 2024. And you can be sure that with these Mexican cartels, the families of the deceased contractors get zero. Actually, there's not even a confirmation that they have been KIA, they're just missing in action. And of course, there's also the same complaints of missing payments, but good luck getting your money from these cartels. Apparently, the situation regarding Colombian mercenaries have reached such an extent that currently Colombian lawmakers are trying to find some sort of solution. On November 27, 2024, Colombian President Petro said on X that mercenarism should be banned in Colombia. So my friends, let's see where all this leads. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The link is in the description below.